Our exclusive town hall with Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And Speaker Pelosi, last night at a reception for MoveOn.org, one of your new members, Rashida Tlaib, who is newly elected Congresswoman from Michigan, used some colorful language to talk about what would happen to Donald Trump, to the president, saying, quote, "We're going to go in and impeach the MFer." Your reaction to that comment?
I probably have a generational reaction to it. But in any event, I'm not in the censorship business. I don't think that, I mean, I don't like that language. I wouldn't use that language. I don't, again, establish any language standards for my colleagues. But I don't think it's anything worse than what the president has said.
Fair enough. But I guess the question would be, does that kind of discussion of impeachment on that level help the cause of oversight in general, or does it make impeachment more likely, less likely? Does it impact the actual trajectory of oversight?
I think it probably consolidates his base, but I don't think they need much consolidation. I don't think it makes that much difference. No.
So you're not concerned at all about the way that the president's base will react to the idea of an incoming Democratic caucus coming in with the idea already pre-baked into the cake? They're going to go and get him. You guys are going to go get him.
Well, you have to weigh the equities. That is not the position of the House Democratic Caucus.
Sure.
And the equity to be weighed that's freedom of speech of an individual member. As I say, generationally, that would not be language I would use.
Sure.
But nonetheless, I don't think we should make a big deal of it. I really don't.
Okay.
I really don't. That's probably the way people talk around. Again, I'm a grandmother, and that's a different story.
Right.
But it's really, words weigh a ton. And the president has to realize that his words weigh a ton too. And some of the words that he used has a direct impact on people's lives. My colleagues' comments do not have an impact on people's lives. Let me just ask you this.
Sure.
If she were a man, would they be making a fuss like that?
You know what? On that point, what do you make of the way that women's words, women's actions are parsed by us, by the public versus men's?
Well, I think that women have to have each other's backs. In other words, it's not a zero-sum game. One woman's success is really a success for all women. And it's not as if you have this, then I'm deprived of that. So I think we all kind of have to stick together on all of this, because there are just behavioral patterns that are, in spite of themselves, some men just can't get over it. But we can't be held up by that. Oh my goodness, I'm such a target for all of it in every possible way. I thrive on it. That's my answer to them. I thrive on it.
Yeah. So then I'll ask you the question. If Rashida Tlaib, if Congresswoman Tlaib was a man, do you think people would make a big deal of it?
Probably less of a deal. Probably less of a deal.
Okay.
But you know what? I don't know why we're making a big deal of it now. It's the way people talk. I think, frankly, that what she said was less offensive than what President Trump said about John McCain, a patriotic man.
What do you make of the fact that you do have some members of your freshman class, and not even just freshmen, who believe that it is time now to impeach the president?
Well, there are members of our caucus who have thought for a while, right, almost 2 years, that was the case. I do think that, as I said before, we want to be unifying, e pluribus unum, bring people together. Impeachment is a very divisive approach to take, and we shouldn't take it for anything other than the facts and the law. And we'll see what happens with the Mueller report.
Well, already, even before it's completed, the Mueller probe has resulted in charges against 33 people, guilty pleas by 5 people with direct ties to the President of the United States.
7.
You've seen in 7 total, but 5 directly tied to him. But you look at the Michael Cohen case, the President has been implicated in a federal crime. What would you need to see in addition to that in order for you to feel that you'd reached the threshold where it's time to begin impeachment hearings?
Well, let me just say, first of all, because you've used the word oversight and investigations, and they're not really interchangeable. Congress has a constitutional responsibility to have oversight over the executive branch. We are the power of the purse, we appropriate the funds, and we have to have oversight as to whether they're being used effectively. So that is our responsibility. We would be delinquent if we didn't do that. When does that go to the place where an investigation is required? Well, you're seeing a culture of cronyism, corruption, and incompetence in this administration where people are dropping off like flies in terms of their own exposure on ethical matters. And so whether it involves the air that our children breathe, the water that they drink, and what is the personal aggrandizement of that secretary to the special interest, the polluters, we want, that's an investigation. That's not the regular oversight. So we could ratchet up to that. In terms of impeachment, we'd have to see different evidence.
Well, I think what Congresswoman Tlaib is getting at, and I think what a lot of people are looking at, is you've had, I mean, the former campaign manager, the campaign manager of the President of the United States is already under investigation for committing crimes. You've got his former national security advisor who's already pleaded guilty. And I guess what a lot of the freshmen, and what would you say to Congresswoman Tlaib, who is saying there's already been enough evidence here that at least the hearings should begin? What do you say to members who say that?
Well, we have three great leaders of the committees of jurisdiction. Elijah Cummings of Maryland, chair of the Committee on Government Reform, the Investigative Committee of Congress, the Oversight Committee of Congress. I used to serve on that. We have Jerry Nadler, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and we have Adam Schiff, the chair of the Intelligence Committee. And they will be reviewing with oversight and possible investigation what happens next. But I think that the outrage that people feel about impeachment is legitimate. I also think that people should be very concerned about what this president is doing to the food our children eat, the air they breathe, the water they drink. This whole Russia investigation is very important, and we have a responsibility to follow the facts where they take us, but not to have it be, and with all due respect to the press spends a lot of time on it. Every single day by executive order, this president is saying we're going to, despite the fact that I signed a bill about nutrition and food stamps and the rest, I'm by executive order going to take those food stamps away. And you know, he's doing really harmful things that affect people in their everyday life, and all the focus is on what might happen, and let's see when that happens.
But I think for a lot of people, though, having acquired the office, if there were crimes committed in the acquisition of the office of president, I think for a lot of people, that's so foundational that you do have a lot of members who believe that the inquiry is necessary, that seeing the president's tax returns, for instance, is necessary. Do you believe that should happen?
Well, we should have seen the president's tax return. I had this experience the other day. I was speaking at an event for our Hidden Heroes, Elizabeth Dole's initiative for caregivers. And as I was walking through, as I usually do, through the kitchen to get to the podium, one of the busboys said to me, "When the president says to you that the Mueller investigation is going on too long, just remind him, not as long as his audit of his tax return."
What do you make of Donald Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin?
I think that the president's relationship with thugs all over the world is appalling. Vladimir Putin, really? I think it's dangerous. But, you know, I think one of the most frightening, with stiff competition, mind you, of things that this president has done, is the firing of Mattis. Now, Mattis resigned. The president likes to say he fired him. But the fact is, Mattis isn't there.
Well, at the risk of circling back.
And the president still is.
At the risk of circling back, firing Jim Comey, firing the FBI director, for a lot of people, is obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice was one of the articles of impeachment used against a prior president.
It could be.
Do you believe that that is obstruction of justice, firing the FBI director?
Well, let me just take it to a larger place. When they impeached President Clinton, it was completely wrong. They should not have done that. It was wrong. It was divisive in the country. It was wrong. In terms of Richard Nixon, there was no impeachment. The Republicans stepped up to the plate and visited the president and said, we can't go on. What's shameful right now is not just the president's behavior in so many respects and his lack of interest in evidence, data, facts, or truth when it comes to making a decision. What's shocking is that the Republicans in the Congress of the United States will not hold him accountable for anything.
And we're going to continue this conversation next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.